Hey everyone, welcome back to Onward podcast. This is Brett. I have my friend Matthew Ehret on today. He's going to be doing a follow-up podcast. We agreed after the last one, which was really looking at the architects behind the decline of Canada. We said we got to do a follow-up part 2 ASAP because, well, at the end of the day, we can look at the decline, we can talk about all of that, and something that Matt mentioned on that podcast, which was patterns of when the victors won, so when the people won, right? And so that kind of like really piqued my interest, and I thought there wasn't a good time to sort of get into that on the last podcast, so that's why we scheduled a part 2. And I think it's a good conversation to have because, you know, there's people that have not just eaten one red pill, but the whole box, and we're finding ourselves strapped for hope right now, a lot of people. And I think that I'm certainly kind of in the middle of all of this where some days are good, some days are bad. I think I do have optimism in many senses. But for a lot of people out there, especially in this space, they're feeling pretty hopeless, you know, after the, let's just pick whatever, right? Canada elections, and we're just watching what's unfolding in the world. And so Matt is hopefully going to sort of give us a bit of a historical picture on when the people fought back and when the people won, and what does that look like historically speaking. But also, are there threads that we can pull out that are happening today where we see some of those patterns as well? So, Matt, welcome back to Onward. How are you today?
Hey Brett, I'm doing good. I'm looking forward to continuing our chat.
Yeah, it's gonna be good. So, I mean, for those of you watching, listening, if you haven't checked out the first episode, just check the show notes below. I'll leave the link right there. It's got some good traffic so far and opened up some good conversation for sure, because most people have not sort of clued in that a lot of what we're experiencing today, you know, this whole idea of history, history doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes, right? And what you did last podcast was great, which is really go back deep into the historical archives and sort of say, hey, the stuff that we're experiencing today, it's not new. You know what I mean? It has you know, deep roots along both sides of the party lines, if you want to look at it like that. But then there were also these times throughout history where, you know, we're standing here today, we're having this conversation, and I think that a lot of people would say, if you just spoke to the normies, right, they would say, what's so bad? Right? Like, look at our life. Like, it's still okay. You know, we can still do all these things. My kids are still having a decent life. We got food on the table and these types of things. But, you know, so do you, first of all, do you see, maybe we'll start by like, what were some of those historical patterns that you've observed in your studies where people fought back and, you know, fought back against tyranny and so forth?
Yeah, that's a perfectly good place to begin. And I guess from my standpoint, the way I would frame it is where has the oligarchy failed? How about that?
Okay.
Because we are living in history and the consequence of both good and bad ideas competing against each other throughout the entirety of all existence before us having this conversation here, right? And there's obviously a lot of points of a failure in our current generations to our contemporary world to recognize the debt owed to the past and of the future. And there's been an abrogation of a lot of the responsibilities that many people today alive, um, and those who are not even here with us anymore have failed the challenge. They failed the test to really carry on the fight, to really evaluate and properly appreciate the sacrifices made to give us these freedoms that we were born into that we take for granted. And if you take something like freedom for granted, it will be taken away from you because the problem is we've always had this parasitical overlord or self-professed overlord class that's been latched on like a parasite over all of human history that hasn't just voluntarily dissolved itself. It's a very stubborn creature. Um, this oligarchical sort of tradition and this inbred network that believes themselves to be sort of higher beings or endowed with powers above the mortals, above the slaves who have to remain subdued and more pacified in order to be better controlled. And that at the end of the day, that's been sort of the ethos of this oligarchy that prefers to remain in the shadows and unseen. Because as soon as people see it, they will be repulsed by it and they will make moves to reduce its influence over them, which has been the case throughout history as well. And we've not been told many of those instances where the oligarchy's influence over us has been reduced enormously and freedom has been increased. I think those stories have been obscured by the very fact that, you know, our history books are shaped by those currently in power, and they don't want us to know
Mm,
those things. So, yeah, I guess that's what we'll sort of hit at today a little bit from a few directions. And there's definitely a few case studies we can spend a little bit of extra time probing to see how this works. Um, Myself, I just so people watching might want to know, a lot of my research on this topic, 'cause I've written a lot of books, and like we talked about last week, there's the 4 volume Untold History of Canada book series that I first published, and then I moved on to the Clash of the Two Americas, 4 volumes, followed by a fifth volume called Science Unshackled, and more recently I did the Revenge of the Mystery Cults trilogy. Um, so there's a lot now. Part of what propels me onward and what got me started was asking the question, is it all meaningless? You know, like I was
mm,
confronted with my own discoveries that the popular myths that govern my world have been a lie. And I was looking at 9/11 and discovering that was a giant lie. And then, it takes you very quickly into other uh topics like JFK's murder, and you start realizing without too much effort that the thing that killed JFK and the thing that did 9/11 are connected, and it's
mhm.
something to do with the banking intelligence architecture. And so before you know it, you're looking at the Federal Reserve, you're looking at false flags, and a lot of things start coming together. So it brought me into a state of nihilism in 2000, and I guess 2004, 2005, when I began to really take the plunge. Um, and there was like a profound sadness. And so again, my question was, is it meaningless? Is there hope? If there's hope, where is it? Because I don't see it.
Yeah.
So I try to look for examples of when did the oligarchy, that was my core question is, has the oligarchy always been playing us like gods with special divine knowledge that they have, that maybe even I started getting into the crazy place in my head for a while. I was like, maybe they are actually doing some form of higher good that we lowly uninitiates can't possibly understand. The
Mm, mm,
higher good that might be the outgrowth of this evil in the moment, right? That's a bad place to be. And it's like,
yeah.
no,
Yeah.
because that means that the universe is really bad. Like,
Yeah, yeah.
that means
Hey,
it's crazy.
question for you. Question
Yeah.
for you. I want to linger on that point a little bit. So you're going back to this in 2004, right? Where you're having this sort of like, oh my gosh, I'm like, what what have I just uncovered here? And holy smokes! And now you're feeling nihilistic, maybe depressed, sad, etc. I think a lot of people are feeling like that right now. I was on a podcast last week or the week before, and the host was like, the host basically said, "Oh my gosh, I woke up during COVID." Like that was it. And I was like, "Oh my gosh, I can't quite imagine," because much like yourself, I've been looking at a lot of these things for a very long time. So when COVID rolled around, it was a matter of like a couple of weeks, and I was like, "Man, okay, something's up here. This is not what they're telling us," and then off we go from there. But I can only imagine, that there's a large percentage of people right now who are in that boat where they're slowly, as the sort of the truther community, let's call them that, starts to unpack a lot of the stuff and start sharing it. You have a lot of people that are like, holy smokes, like what the hell is actually going on in the background here? Because we had no idea. And there are a lot of people right now feeling like nihilistic, depressed, powerless, like there's no hope. Because no matter who we vote for, they're starting to realize that voting doesn't really matter. I'm not in charge. How do I actually exert any kind of power or influence over my own destiny or our collective destiny? So my question to you is, we're fast forward for you, call it 20 years. Where are you at now? Like just in terms of, I mean, you're someone that's probably like a walking encyclopedia relative to most people. How do you process this stuff on a regular basis, knowing what you know?
Hmm. Hmm. Interesting formulation. Well, yeah, I mean, you and I, we've been chewing on this a lot, so I guess like what you just said resonated with me too. My wife and I, we already kind of came to terms with the fact that a death cult took over our society
Hmm.
way before we were born. And so when COVID was sprung, we were like,
Yeah.
no, okay.
Yeah.
We were like maybe a week and a half, 2 weeks of confusion, and then we're like, no, this is part of it. But it is definitely it's a complex question because on the one hand, having done the work on history that I've done and just trying to probe, and I luckily had some good um guidance. I had some good uh people who mentored me in some ways, that I really appreciated the type of techniques that they encouraged, going to source material, looking to the people who made history for good or for bad and read them. Avoid like read mainstream history books to the degree that you know that you're looking through a trash bin, just to sort of
Mm,
see what kind of traps or narrative traps are being deployed to try to account for real things that did happen. So it's useful to like hold in mind a variety of lies that are
yeah.
promoted by academia and the mainstream. So in the course of doing that, it's a weird, it's like a mixed feeling, right?
Yeah.
There's a joy and a sadness, like a melancholy sadness, but a happiness because you're making discoveries about truth, and you're also in so doing discovering more and more why human beings have this higher divine quality of beauty and goodness that the oligarchy is authentically afraid of. Like every time
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
higher genius has emerged in matured, integrated human beings, it's resulted in heightened powers of an ability to communicate beauty, to produce beauty, music, the arts, architecture, political freedoms like the sciences have improved in qualitative manners that could never have happened under any type of system of oligarchical controls. The oligarchy can't improve upon anything. They can only take things that have been created by good people, and then they could try to co-opt them and use them for enslaving others, and that includes the arts, thus make them worse in decay. But they can't actually create anything of a higher ordering from a lower ordering. They just can't do it because they're of a lower ordering essence.
Hmm.
They're what you call it, a death cult.
Yeah.
It worships it's animated by principles that are disobedient to the principle of life and creativity that seems to animate everything in the universe. Um, so that there's this again. It's sad because you're like, oh shit, like they're pretty damn sophisticated and enduring. Um, and you're like, why can't we pull our heads out of our asses after all of these traps we've fallen into as a species again and again? Why are we still not learning? So that's sad. And then, but the good thing is, again, you're like you do develop a better. I have a much better appreciation for the type of personality, the self-aware personality of like a Ben Franklin by reading Ben Franklin's writings, evaluating what did he do in the time that he had, how was he trained by Cotton Mather and other patriots in the colonies, how did he discover electricity, how did he see his discovery of electricity as tied to his understanding, his faith in political natural law, which were in his mind two sides of the same thing. Cultural, like what did he do with his work in poetry, in publishing Confucius's Analects into the colonies, as well as Poor Richard's Almanac, and all of these amazing things that he did with his printing press. So he was able to like upshift the culture because he knew that you needed to have a certain psychologically, emotionally matured people who are highly literate and highly self-rigorous and moral in order to even have the possibility of an American Revolution to happen, which didn't exist in 1740 or 1750 when he was working on his scientific works. The culture didn't exist. They might have
Hmm.
wanted to have freedom if you did a survey of your average American colonist or British colonist in the Americas. Would you prefer freedom over tyranny? They'd be like, yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
you want to now organize a conspiracy and risk your life to make it happen, and they would not have been able to do that. They just didn't have that. So they needed the Benjamin Franklin years of effort with his networks to uplift the culture. Um, so that was part of my discovery was just the appreciation of both the brilliance of what the human mind can do when it's being natural and not inhibited by this oligarchical crap, and number two, how the oligarchy has lost control so many times when it's tried at different moments to pass the axe onto us, or to like lay down the axe to get
Yeah.
their feudalistic world of death and stasis under a feudal sort of control grid. They've tried, and it's not like we got all of these, today we have electricity. I can read you and I can have this conversation across space and
Hmm.
time
Hmm.
in light speed. And it's like either this was just given to us by a bored oligarchy who wanted to give their toys something to play with, right? So they gave us progress and a life expectancy which is much higher than our great great grandparents had enjoyed a century ago. Um, or it was fought for and they happen. And I contend the evidence points to the fact that it was fought for every step of the way. Every inch of real progress was a fight
Hmm.
against the oligarchy's will. That also involved what Ben Franklin stepped into as sort of the part of a process that existed before him that he amplified significantly in his time, which was the codification of the sovereign nation state as an institution, as sort of a modern metaphysical technology that we can make better or worse based on the ideas we adhere to, but that the organization of government itself is a form of metaphysical technology,
Hmm.
um, which is why I think the oligarchy's been so obsessed with getting rid of the sovereign nation state system in order to replace it with some form or another of world government or managerial pan regions that they want to fascistically sort of control jurisdictionally the world under a high priest class. They've been obsessed with getting rid of the sovereign nation state itself, which has been, I think, a big part of my story. The thing I found as a recurring theme in the patterns I've looked at has been every time that humanity has successfully defeated the will of the oligarchy, it's been when we've organized and conspired, as Ben Franklin did, or as many others have done that I document in my books. We've conspired in such a manner to wield the power of the nation state as a tool of defense of humanity and offense against the oligarchy at the same time. And when we
Huh.
fail to do that, the oligarchy tends to win and gain more influence.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, it's almost like to me, then it's dual purpose, right? So we can look at the information that we're learning, and sometimes, especially for people who have maybe not had as long a runway as someone like yourself or myself have had, it can be pretty shocking, right? And so your natural, I guess, the flow of emotions that you might go through is like, oh my gosh, like shock, then despair, anger, et cetera, et cetera. But maybe if you spend a long enough time looking at it, you can start to see some of these patterns and go, well, I could take this as being empowering at the same time, because the truth stands on its own. Like, it doesn't need to be defended, it defends itself. And I think that what we're uncovering, even though there's a sea of misinformation, disinformation, propaganda and whatnot, we can see what's going on. I think, and that's becoming more apparent to everyone. So my hope is that by having these types of conversations and sharing this type of content and the work that you're doing, it's like bring this out into the open, so that all of us can actually participate in the conversation and go, hey, maybe it is time for an uprising or some kind of revolution or something. I don't know, because from what you've just told me, it seems to me, and maybe you have a different opinion on this, in Canada right now, it seems to me like there has not been any significant pushback at all. And with the recent political events and so forth, it seems to me almost like the oligarchy is encroaching further into Canada, and the people are not necessarily using the state to rise up and defend themselves, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's a bit sad, the Canadian case. The only place, like I think made mention in our last chat, that there's some spark of life is on the west coast in Alberta, principally Alberta as a
Yeah,
province, where there is I think the basis or the foundation upon which a legitimate type of movement can exist. I don't know if it's sustainable. I just don't know the level of wisdom and insight in those who are trying to lead it.
yeah,
And leadership is a big deal when you're trying to deal with the oligarchy. If you don't have competent, insightful leadership, not just people who feel strongly about something or can speak well, but really have those other qualities too,
yeah,
it usually doesn't work out. And we've seen
yeah,
examples of that in Canada's case, where I think you and I also made reference to this with our one attempt to have a real Republican revolution in 1837 or 1838.
mm,
It started in 1837. It was subverted in 1838. Was by people who were authentically good people. Louis Joseph Papineau, William Lyon Mackenzie, good people, organizing good people who wanted freedom. But they were compared to, like I mentioned, Ben Franklin, who was much more patient, had more insight into the nature of the terrain he was operating on, the cultural terrain. They skipped steps. They were
mm,
impatient. They moved too quickly. They didn't take the time to understand their enemy or understand the cultural problems that they had to deal with in Canada. And because of that, they fell into every single trap that was set before them. And within like 2 seconds, the revolution was over. Everybody was hung or sent off to Australia. Um, and that was it. It was done. And that was like the last real
Yeah.
revolutionary attempt that we had.
So
So, um, the way I see it in Canada now, it's like, yeah, Alberta has got something moral going. I hope that there's something more. I don't see it necessarily being the Canadian government as a federal institution is so heavily controlled by the enemies of humanity and has been for so long. I think the last time we had an authentic spark of life in Ottawa, which is the capital of Canada, was probably John Diefenbaker, who was ousted in a Rhodes Scholar managed coup d'etat in 1963 when he tried to nationalize the Bank of Canada. And he was never forgiven for that. And he was ousted,
hmm,
including people within his own administration and other Rhodes Scholars within his own cabinet played a role in doing this with British intelligence to oust him. And I think that was the last kind of populist representation we had ever had in the Canadian federal political scene that had any kind of real power. Provincially, I think Danielle Smith has some humanity in her. It's probably something to work with there. That's the premier of Alberta.
yeah, yeah,
Um, but no, I mean this is where for me I get really sad if I don't take a global contextual look at things that I'm living in. I get it's there. It's easy to get blackpilled.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
I do.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
But I
that's what
mean,
I encourage.
so you bring up Alberta. Like, do you feel that the Alberta call it the Alberta movement, right? The separatist movement. Does that have the same kind of underpinnings, philosophy, etc., at some of these other movements that you've seen in history? Perhaps in a modern
It has
context, it's more
elements of it.
diluted. I don't know.
Yeah, more diluted. It has
Yeah,
more. It has the essential elements that I've seen. It doesn't have the cultural educational
yeah,
sophistication that I've seen as being important, extremely important to make these things work. That's highly lacking. So without that cultural maturity, that sophistication, a lot of blind spots will be there for people to fall into that involve like I mean I love going to Calgary and I love going to Alberta and I talk to a lot of the freedom groups. I'm going to be going there in a few weeks again to do a tour, a set of speeches and talk to people. And I guess from what I'm gathering is that what I've noticed is that there's a tendency to want to believe blindly in narratives that anybody who could speak about the New World Order and who can use certain Christian tropes or linguistic
mm,
tricks that are
mm,
attractive to the Christian ear, they will believe that person if they can speak with apparent emotional authenticity and accept any other element of their narratives without question, to the point that they, people become it's like a childlike immaturity and a tendency to believe very quickly in false narratives that are designed to undo the potency that they could otherwise have about the fight that they think that they're having. Now, not everybody is like this, but a disturbingly large number of patriots and of a conservative mindset
yeah,
fall into this category in my assessment, which is dangerous because I think that those narratives are being seeded by controllers or agents who are being amplified as representing the voice of the people against the Great Reset. And many of them, I don't really want to go into names right
no,
now,
no,
but
no. We don't
many
need
of
to.
them, when you
Yeah,
start scratching on the surface, you're like, oh shit, you're part of the operation.
yeah,
Um, so that's a problem that I it's not just Canadians. It's
yeah. It's
European
everywhere. Yeah,
conservatives, it's American conservatives, Australian conservatives, you name it, fall into these problems because it's part of our culture. We're creatures of a culture, and I think for me, it is the thing. So the culture itself has largely been shaped by warfare operations, cultural warfare operations, which people need to look at seriously as far as what created the British invasion, the CIA MK Ultra operations that gave us all of the drugs in our society that are so prevalent. The psilocybins, the
mm-hmm,
LSD,
mm-hmm.
the DMT, the just the weed culture in general. This wouldn't be a thing in our society were it not for the CIA, MI6, military intelligence, Tavistokian psychiatrists in the
Yeah.
from the 20s to the 60s overseeing that, including a lot of the Hollywood films, scripts that are selected and turned into things that shape our subconscious forces.
Yeah.
The Planet of the Apes, the Soylent Greens, the 2001: A Space Odysseys, all of these things were part of the same psyop to make our culture weakened so that we don't actually understand what the nature of humanity and the fight is all about. So these are all factors, and I didn't even get
Yeah.
into the Aleister Crowley,
Oh yeah.
Beatles, and
Yeah.
Rolling Stones and all these things,
Yeah.
like which again
Yeah.
are hugely influential in tempering the emotional our emotions and how we aesthetically judge beauty and ugliness are being affected in a way
Yeah.
that our minds are not even aware of these things that shape our hearts. And if
Yeah.
we don't deal with that very discoverable war against our culture that happened over the dead bodies of JFK and Martin Luther King, we also, I don't think, are going to be properly equipped to really deal with the challenges that are going to be falling in front of us increasingly.
Yeah. Well, and you can see that playing out right now, right? It's like where people don't know what to believe, you know what I mean? Like that's one thing. And so when you start, exploring these types of conversations where it's like, oh my gosh, something benign, you know what I mean? You mentioned
Yeah.
Hollywood. Oh my gosh, well, they're just making movies for entertainment. And it's like, well, not really, because Hollywood is the wood of the holly tree, and this was used by the magicians, so Hollywood magic is literally magic. And then you start peeling back the layers of Hollywood, and you're like, holy smokes, there's some pretty dark stuff there, and it's a weird kind of cult, and so on and so forth. And all the stuff that's happening now with the music industry, same idea. You look at Super Bowl halftime shows, and why is this stuff gone all weird? Olympics opening ceremonies, all these types of things. These are essentially, whether you want to call it predictive programming or whether it is, like, as you say, softening people up to accept certain things. Another thing that I've been seeing a lot of is portals. So you'll see a lot of movies now, portals. Stranger Things,
Mm.
there's a portal. And if you look at the Ozempic commercial, which happens, I don't know how I've come across that, but it's been in my orbit. It's a giant, it's a giant orb, basically. This portal in the tree. So if you want the Ozempic drug to lose weight, well, then she looks at the portal in the tree and walks through the portal. So it's kind of weird. So all of these weird things that are kind of happening, where I think for most people it's well below subconscious or well below conscious awareness. But as you say, these have been put through into culture and society over many, many decades, and most people sort of go, well, here we are. These things are just benign. You know what I mean? Um, but
Yeah,
I think all
agreed.
that to say,
Yeah,
you I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that, Matt.
yeah. Well, yeah, it caught my memory too because I remember right
Yeah.
before Francis died, Pope Francis died. He opened the five portals as well. Like he had this ritual, which for the first time ever, the Vatican opened the fifth portal, which was some weird gate in a prison in Rome. It's weird.
Yeah.
But you're right. Like it's there. You see it also in the Hadron Collider. Like there's this weird occultism
Yeah,
that
I was
seems to
actually
have
going to bring
taken.
up. Yeah, I was going to bring up CERN right out. So I was in Geneva, like a year and a half ago, somewhere around there, and I actually went to
Mm.
CERN, and it was a super weird experience. I got to say, I stood at the top, like above ground, and there was this weird energy. Like a bunch of people that I was with, we were like, man, I gotta leave. Like I had to leave the building because it was just it. I did not feel good at all. But that's also portal related. You know what I mean? It's the same kind of
Yeah,
idea.
well,
So.
and so this is the thing, right? Like nothing in our society is unaffected by these cultists, this occult agency, which has its own cosmology. We mentioned it has the attribute of being a death cult. That's
Hmm.
one attribute. There's
Yeah,
other
yeah,
corollaries to this fact as well, and of that, one of the other corollaries is if you believe that death is um death is more powerful than the principle of life, or entropy is more powerful than the principle of anti-entropy in the grand scheme of things. In Then you will tend to have form of Manichaean cosmology, and a Manichaean cosmology. This emerges out of the followers of Mani, this esoteric
hmm,
Zoroastrian figure. He wasn't even representing Zoroastrianism. Honestly, he got killed by the Zoroastrian government, who was like, "No, you're doing something demonic." And but he had a huge cult following, and he had some Christian trappings, some Gnostic Christian elements to his gospel, and he created a big movement. Saint Augustine was an early follower before Augustine realized where the fallacies were and broke free and started attacking it, rightfully so. But in the Manichaean worldview, which is overly elaborate, there's basically archons, like these angelic and demonic forces that represent elementals, kind of like elementals of light and darkness, that
Hmm.
are both presumed to have equal claim to substantiation.
Hmm.
So in the Manichaean world here, that's the big fallacy, right? So it all kind of hinges upon this idea that in the universe of light balanced with darkness, both light and darkness have in their essential character claim to substance. Augustine would make the point, and does, that the fallacy is that light is the only one of the two that actually have substantiate, or that are substantial, because and you could test it and take candles into a dark room to find that the darkness is eliminated
Dissipates.
by the
Yeah.
appearance of right? Yeah, but you can't take darkness into a light room to have darkness eliminate the light.
Hmm. Hmm.
Darkness itself is the absence of light. So the very act of seeing of the night itself is we're on the other side of the earth where the sun's light isn't hitting, and so you get shade. So it's the to identify it correctly as the absence of that which exists is much more reasonable. Although human beings are an additional factor, whereas like the earth and night and light doesn't have free will per se, and humans do. We can choose to believe or believe that black is white, as Bertrand Russell said, or as Ignatius Loyola had people train their minds to do, right, in his exercises, is that if your superior who represents a divine will wants you to believe that white is black, so must you believe that white is black. And that's what Bertrand Russell used in his works on getting kids to believe that snow is gray or black. So why am I saying this? Just that, okay, so in their world, because of this idea that the good only has meaning because of evil. They think of it that way, and that the
Huh.
elementals representing, or the archons, or whatever. There's different variations, aeons. There's different variations of these
Sure.
spirit beings that they postulate exist, representing both sides. Um, we have to do honor to both the sacred and the profane. So to
Hmm.
properly appreciate, because the good is only meaningful because there is evil. So you have to realize that good needs evil. Good wants evil, right? So it doesn't take long before the mind does enough
Yeah.
backflips, and all of a sudden you're like trying to unify creation and destruction. You're trying to have sex while killing somebody. You're trying
Yeah.
to, like, sex being a creative act and killing being an eliminational act. And so they start trying to merge into these moral opposites activities that nobody should ever have to do. Ignorance and wisdom become increasingly fused together in like irrationalism. And this is the type of, like, it's difficult for a normal human mind to even imagine how that's a thing. So it gives them that our inability to appreciate this absurdity, for the most part, for most humans. It takes a lot of work to make your mind go there. It acts as kind of like a protective field for the oligarchy. And as H.G. Wells had once said, the British Empire's greatest defense is people's unwillingness to imagine evil. And
Hmm.
H.G. Wells was somebody who was, not a little guy. He used the architect of most of the predictive programming methods that have been utilized by Hollywood in his so-called fictional novels, and even in his nonfiction works like the Open Conspiracy and Blueprint for the World Brain, and the New World Order books that he wrote in the 30s and 40s. It's all like the outline that has been followed to a T by his followers, right? So I'm just saying this because the, they have taken over science too. This is where the Rockefeller
Yeah.
Foundation really took over a
Medicine.
lot of the
Yeah.
practice of science. Yeah, in medicine, in physics, plasma physics, like every branch of mathematics, physics, you name it, biological, chemical sciences have been nothing has been not influenced by this grouping. And what they've been trying to do, especially after people like Max Planck and Einstein and Kurt Gödel died, is they got their occultists around people like Niels Bohr and Max Heisenberg, who are part of this mathematicians grouping that denied the existence of truth. All of them denied the possibility that truth exists
Oh
or is
wow.
knowable, because they were all mathematical probability theorists and believed that the only way we could know anything was through the science of rolling of the dice, which is where the debate between Bohr and Einstein, there's this often quoted citation from Einstein that God doesn't play dice. Well, that was the context in which he was saying that, was against Bohr, who was saying the only way we can know the mind of the creator is through randomness, through his probabilistic sort of mathematical modeling, which could tell us maybe where an electron may or may not be, whether it may or may not act like a wave or a particle, maybe, but it's the science of maybes. And within the science of maybes, they were able to create, in the 50s especially, peer-reviewed published documents that started justifying alternative dimensions that you could mathematically create 13, 14, 29 dimensions in their string theory models, but they had no testability because they were just mathematical entities that only existed to make the math work. They didn't have any testability. You could start creating whole constructs of things that had no claim to reality, like dark matter, dark energy they started talking about, which again, what the fuck is that? It's nothing.
Yeah.
It's untestable by its essence. But they started believing that 99% of the universe is dark energy, dark matter. And essentially what they started doing is they started infusing this notion that we can scientifically justify, maybe with the help of drugs that can help us tap into the fifth dimension, which started taking over in the 70s, that maybe there's demon forces that we can channel that live in another dimension that string theory models have proven exist. And it became something that then took over things like the decision making that went into the creation of CERN, which is doing like some useful science by slamming particles together, but it's animated by a whole cosmology and philosophy that believes in channeling our our uh, our ourselves into invoking these demons from some Gnostic,
Yeah.
hierarchy of evil beings that can maybe do the will of the powerful, and so you get like women being sacrificed in front of like Kali, like
Hmm.
the giant
Hmm.
statue of Kali at CERN, and things like that start happening. And it's like then the question is, do they really have this power? Are there really demonic forces that are giving the oligarchy and their minions power, or is it crazy land gone amok? And I'm of the view that they actually don't have, that they've created an imaginary world that they're living into, but that I don't actually, I used to think that they had higher powers. At this point, I think
Okay.
that they've driven themselves nuts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. Well, let's chat about that then. Like, because I think that a lot of people are there right now. We talk about spiritual war, right? So there's a spiritual war
Mm.
going on, and it's like, so spiritual war. I mean, what does that even mean? Then you know what I mean? Like, do we actually have these opposing dark and light forces? Do the people in charge, are they? You hear this all the time, right? You hear they're Satanists, they're pedophiles. That's who runs the world, and it's like, is that the case? Like, do they actually have these like dark powers, dark intentions, or like what's really going on there? You know what I mean? And you mentioned the light. So on last week's or this week's podcast, depending when you listen to it, we actually spoke a lot about that. It's about us, and perhaps we can work our way into that. Is what is required then? You know what I mean? If there is truly these dark forces, or if they've just made all this stuff up, how do we take back our power? Like what does that
Yeah.
divine essence look like? What does the light look like, for us? Because
Yeah.
most people right now that I can tell anyway, the people that are aware of what's happening are pretty consumed by the dark forces. You know what I mean? The
Yeah.
people that are looking at this stuff. Like,
Yeah.
yeah. I don't know if you had
Yeah.
if you wanted to continue that.
Yeah, sure. And you could be like, those statements are not mutually exclusive, right? Like you can
Mm,
be a Satanist and a pedophile with power over the world, and yet not have access to supernatural forces that assist you in doing that. Um,
true. Yeah. True. True.
right. So, but I think part of the big magic of the oligarchy, the magic tricks that they pull, partially is it's the age of the sorcerers. In my mind, the age
Mm,
of the sorcerers never ended.
okay.
Um, a lot of it is magic tricks. So you can use, especially with the help of modern telecommunications and media, you can create the art of illusions in ways that previous ages oligarchs could only dream of.
Yeah.
Um, pulling the rabbit
Yeah.
out of the hat. The rabbit's already been removed. It hasn't been in the hat for like 3 minutes, but people still think that the rabbit's in the hat. The guy moved it out of the hat. Now
Yeah.
you can expand that and mixed with Um, our school system. So if they can control, the oligarchy acts in three domains at the same time. I think you and I talked about this a little bit last time too.
Mm.
The mind, body, soul aspect. So the different parameters of what shapes those three aspects of the human condition are acted upon at the same time by the oligarchy. So the material condition, right? The food production, the productive powers of labor, the geopolitical aspects,
Mm-hmm.
obviously very important, but not the most important. Um, because more than that is like intellectually, we know that if you can if you can grow your intellect and understanding of the laws of nature through a healthy school system, and then you can use your powers of intellect to discover where the limits are and then how to make a new discovery scientifically that will allow for you to leap over those limits to growth, which the oligarchy requires we adapt to in order to remain more well-behaved talking
Mm.
cattle.
Mm. Mm.
So you have to then also manipulate the school system. If you can't remove access to literacy and schooling completely, as the oligarchy might like, the next best thing would be to try to corrupt it and influence it in a way that gives people the feeling like they've been educated, but actually have been debilitated from their ability
Yeah.
to have true knowledge about any of the things that they think that they've become specialists within, right? And we've seen so many examples of that in the medical field, but everywhere.
Yeah. Everywhere.
Um,
Yeah.
Nothing's untouched.
Yeah.
So that's the next thing. But then the other, and I think most important part is the realm of culture and the heart.
Mm.
So the aesthetical aspect of judging the good, the beauty and the ugliness of ideas of aesthetics in general, they got to scramble that. That's probably the most important one for the oligarchy, and probably the least appreciated for those who have tried to fight the oligarchy for most of the time. The least appreciated of the three has been the most important one, which is the aesthetical fight. That's where the why the oligarchy put so much effort through their instruments like the newly created CIA in the 1940s to create the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which put millions, countless millions, right, of dollars into creating these new schools of art, like abstract art, contemporary art, atonalism, nihilistic philosophers and
Mm.
poets. All of this was would not, it's not something we organically as a human species just ran to and started liking after World War II. It was given to us by the CIA, and then it started taking on more of a life of its own over time as people started thinking, oh, if I want to be a good artist and get my grant from the government or get my grant from the Rockefeller Foundation, I gotta meet the popular aesthetic that will get me my
Yeah.
grant. And the same thing was happening in sciences. If I want to keep my job and keep my prestige, or if I want to get published or get a grant to do research, I have to pay homage to those um, axioms that are being promulgated by my payers, the people who have the money and the purse strings. So that just corrupts it. And then a couple of generations later, people are doing it
It's
thinking
the
that
norm.
it's natural.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they don't realize just how crazy it actually is. So um, I'm saying this because now I think when I look at the beautiful ideas that gave rise to the Golden Renaissance, that was a great example of a time where the oligarchy lost. Where the actual organizational system of the oligarchy itself, and I say the oligarchy, and I know different people listening might have different
Sure. Sure.
ideas of what that word means. I just mean it in the simplest way: the rule by the few, and I'll also add hereditary. So the hereditary
Mm.
oligarchy, um, of the rule by the few bloodlines who um have an occult quality about them, like who are
Sure.
animated by certain occult cosmologies and techniques of control using magic tricks, and power projection and keeping us stupid and detached from ourselves. So the degree that they can do that and keep us divided from ourselves internally and our neighbor, we're more manageable and more predictable. We're not able to actually actualize any of those freedoms that were fought for us. So the I'm saying this in a lot of words, and I probably shouldn't have to use so many words, but I did. Um, the Dark Age was a time when the populations of Europe and most of the world went through a serious collapse. And the Dark Ages, there were several parameters that I think went into the management of this mass kill off of the human species. The forever wars of the Crusades were one aspect. The destruction of a sense of future when people are just born into forever wars their parents, their mom died of dysentery. Their dad was a mercenary who died. Like it screws up your culture.
Yeah.
But then you also had a speculative banking system run by the Lombards and the Peruzzis, which also was based upon making money with nothing, speculating, and that collapsed. So you had sort of a perfect storm finally, where everything blew out, sanitation melted down, the ability to have commerce melted down, the ability to sustain people melted down, and the populations collapsed completely in Europe, and it became the Dark Age. And it was overjoyed. It was a time of mass superstition. Witch covens increased in abundance in the 13th and 14th century. It was like the Renaissance time for Dark Age satanic witch covens and cults.
Huh.
Sometimes cults like the Flagellants were walking around whipping themselves, thinking that it's because they're human that God is punishing us by giving us this shit world. Um, so what allowed for that type of age with no hope and only despair to then, in a couple of generations, emerge out of with a Renaissance, producing all of this wonderful beauty and orphans who all of a sudden had access to great literacy and like music, polyphonic music was going through revolutions and new sciences were coming into being. So, and you can see that on the population demographic charts, right? All of a sudden, the populations of Europe go from like crap, and then all of a sudden, it's like a geometric increase after the mid 15th century, and you're like, what the hell happened? And that's where I think it gets really interesting to see some of the political fights around networks who were followers of St. Augustine and Plato, who had attained political power, around such people like Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa, who was a great scientist, artist, figure, a statesman, who gave rise in many of his works, which he wrote in Platonic dialogues. And he was so influential. He was like the influencer of Pope Pius II, the guy
Hmm.
who cracked down on all of the witch covens of Italy, and just excommunicated whole cities because they had gone over to the dark side, doing human sacrifices, things like that.
Crazy.
And yeah, no, it was big. And so you had these guys who were introducing a new idea that for the first time, all human beings are created in the image of a living, loving, reasonable God. And because of that, the leaders who bear uh, political influence have that responsibility to act as servants of the people and God by encouraging the increase of our innate potentials by investing in schools, internal improvements, canals. And so you can read the writings of Cusa's work. Cusa's also citing Dante Alighieri and Dante Alighieri's De Monarchia, which he was also writing to try to get across the idea of a society founded upon natural law, as was St. Augustine
Hmm.
in his City of God, where he's like, this is what a society that is fit morally to survive would have to look like. And he's doing it as a not just as an intellectual exercise, but they're really themselves engaged directly in the fight with the enemy. They're risking their lives. Dante Alighieri himself was killed when he was leaving Venice for a reason. Um, and they're creating a challenge for and a blueprint for good people to conspire to manifest what is necessary and what is possible. And in Kuza's world, he writes a number of dialogues which become immensely important for the revolutions politically that gave rise to this explosion in population and beauty and sciences and medicine in the 15th, 16th century, and that people like later on Ben Franklin studied, was immersed in, and that allowed for a lot of the founding fathers to become empowered to understand how does that work. Because the oligarchy would have preferred that we always remain forever in a feudal death cult of Dark Age. They didn't want that to end. We would still be there if it was up to the oligarchy's desires. So it's because of this other quality that the oligarchy um, it despises that we've been given this opportunity to have this conversation here today. And I would say the American case alone, and then I'll stop my rant. But in the case of the American Republic alone, I don't think that there's been even though it's so young and it's only been around for 200 and barely 50 years. Despite that, not only have there been so many presidents who have died while in office, which is a big part of my books and my research, is to investigate what they're all doing, because it's the same thing in different degrees. But also, there's been not a single nation which has posed so many successful examples of overthrowing the New World Order from 1776 up until the present, with at least five, maybe six examples in the 20th century alone of
Hmm.
the U.S. organizing its faculties correctly around the constitutional documents that gave power to patriots to organize policies that disrupted heavily the oligarchy's one world government dark age agenda.
Okay. Well, so I want to come back to that because that's very interesting, and maybe even just like one or two examples in the American context, like you mentioned, 19th century. I mean, that's just really like yesterday in the grand scheme of things. What can you give us a couple of examples of what you're talking about?
Yeah. 1923 to 25, President Warren Harding came to power. 1921, he died. I think he was murdered in 23. But he was working with bipartisan patriots from both parties who recognized what had actually killed Abraham Lincoln and what had killed Garfield and what had killed McKinley and what created the Federal Reserve. And it's a chapter in my volume 2 of The Clash of the Two Americas, where this entity that was um, infiltrating the USA was also behind the creation of the League of Nations, which was created in
Mm,
1919 as a solution to World War One, which the oligarchy, surprise, surprise, also created.
shocker.
uh, no, as a theme, right?
Yeah.
So the League of Nations was supposed to be the heralded revival of the global British Empire under the Bank of England as the managerial economic sort of driver. The Covenant, the League of Nations Covenant, which was heavily influenced by H.G. Wells and his writings, it becomes it denies the right for sovereign nations to exercise influence over their military or economic systems. Covenant 10 and 11 of the League of Nations Covenant do that. Um, Warren Harding, but it demanded that everybody sign up and get on board and nobody make bilateral decisions anymore. Everyone was supposed to go through the League of Nations if they wanted a loan, if they wanted to make a treaty with another country. But Warren Harding, being um, smarter human being than many of those alive today, realized that that's a trap, and he fought against that. He ensured that the U.S. was going to make bilateral treaties with Austria, with Russia, with Germany, with China. Sun Yat-sen's China, whom he was working with very closely, um, and disrupted the that plan to invoke that one world government under eugenics priesthood back then. And I would say a
Mm,
second time would be 1932. 1932, after the Great Depression had already been waging for a number of years, and the Great Depression, again, surprise, surprise, was
yeah.
a controlled demolition of the bubble economy of the 20s. That was,
Yep.
the J.P. Morgan and Company pulled the plug at the same time, and wealth transfer, Great Reset, and just make people shock therapy them, make them suffer, make them soft and mushy so that they'll accept fascism as a solution to put food on their table for the first time after they've seen their kids starve. So that was the idea of 32. The form it then took was the London Monetary and Financial London Conference on um, Currency and Finance. And this conference was inaugurated by the King. It was the brainchild of Lord John Maynard Keynes, who was, as H.G. Wells, a leading Fabian eugenicist. And it brought together about 66 countries of the world who were all suffering because of the collapse of the stock markets. And the idea of this conference was to create a one world government under the League of Nations, the Bank of International Settlement. Oh no, yeah, the Bank of International Settlements had just been created, as well as the Bank of England. Those three powers were supposed to determine the control system of the one world government. And it was unfortunate for them at the time that the one nation that didn't participate or removed their delegation was the USA. And that was
Mm,
because Franklin Roosevelt came in and he had a different idea, having studied Abraham Lincoln's works and having studied the techniques of like the American system of political economy, which was not it's not something we're allowed to learn about in school anymore. It's been written out of our textbooks or slandered and misconstrued, but he studied what actually works as far as constitutional banking, the role of the nation in regards to private finance. And so he was able to break up the Wall Street banks, declare war on them, avoid two assassination attempts at the same time as he vetoed the London Conference by removing the US delegation from having any influence or participation. And without the USA, the whole thing fell apart. And John Maynard Keynes cursed him quite heavily, but it bought humanity a lot of time to rebuild, re-empower the nation state, re-empower the people, which was something that happened during the 1930s, and that I go through in depth in my book,
Mm.
The Clash of the Two Americas, Volume 2 and 3. Um, I would say the third big example of the disruption of the New World Order would have been the when it became realized that it wasn't going to happen peacefully. The bankers that were financing Hitler and fascism more
Mm.
broadly, from the 20s onward, realized that they had to do it more forcefully, and so they started putting all of their resources into the Hitler Mussolini compact, to sort of use these guys as battering rams to
Mm.
force nations to get rid of their sovereignty and conditions of a new type of fascist regime, but under sort of jurisdictions. So, Hitler would have his Lebensraum, he would have his Russia slave colony to use as cheap labor, where the Untermenschen, the underhumans who are the Slavs, would just be used as workers for the ones who were allowed to live and not be eugenicized. And they would feed the Lebensraum, the growing of the more perfect race that would be encouraged to breed, whereas the underhumans would not be allowed to breed. Um, Italy would have their jurisdiction in parts of Africa. Franco had his promise to control big chunks of Latin America. Japan had their fascist control system with Asia and the Han Chinese as their underhumans to extract wealth out of as their human slaves. So the world was going to be sort of, and the British Empire under the original pact that Britain had with Hitler was for Britain to be ultimately in control of India, much of Africa. The Commonwealth would be relatively intact. The Anglo side of that would involve the Pilgrim Society. So people like, Tucker Carlson and his father are members of an organization that Henry Kissinger used to run called the Pilgrim Society, which was designed in 1902 with the death of McKinley to encourage the reintegration of the USA back into the British Empire.
Mm.
And so the British fascists, the J.P. Morgans, the Rockefellers, the Eastern Establishment fascists were all part of the Pilgrim Society operation. It interfaced with the Rhodes Milner grouping.
Mm-hmm.
The Rhodes
Yeah.
Trust
Yeah.
being devoted to recapturing the U.S. And they were going to be promised their pro-Hitler jurisdiction as well, managing a big chunk of North America, maybe some of Central America, maybe Greenland. Um, and that's how the world was supposed to be divided under that New World Order, with a eugenics religion for the elites to manage the depopulating human herd. And again, that would have probably have worked had it not been for Franklin Roosevelt for a second time thwarting that operation with allies in Russia and in China, who were able to collaborate, as well as Charles de Gaulle, honorable mention, who disrupted that effort at a one world forever government of feudalism. Um, and it's taken them some time to undo the policies that were put in place to rein in Wall Street and the private, you know, um, oligarchical community
Yeah.
by Roosevelt and his allies, who involved people from both parties, and from the municipal to the federal to the state level. Like, there was a big movement, a big conspiracy that involved a lot of people like Paul Robeson, singers like Paul Robeson,
Hmm.
Helen Keller, who was
Oh
working with
wow.
Paul
Okay.
Robeson. Yeah, Helen Keller and Paul Robeson were actually friends. They were working together with Albert Kahn, a wonderful historian who did an amazing work on the Nazi British fifth columnist in America, published in 1942, and it's available on archive.org still. These were like incredibly smart people working with Harry Hopkins and Henry Wallace and others, and they had problems, but they were really good. And they were all purged after World War II was over and after Roosevelt was dead and his enemies took power. A lot of these people were all labeled red commies. They were taken out of. Some of them were murdered. Some of them were just removed completely from polite society and not allowed. Like Paul Robeson couldn't perform publicly anymore. He got no gigs.
Hmm.
He couldn't travel. His passport was removed by
Wow.
Hoover.
Wow.
And yeah, so that was part of it. And this is what JFK tried to undo, a lot of that damage, by undoing the blacklists and undoing the control system of Allen Dulles and others. But JFK was only partially successful, as we know, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So fascinating, and I have to like there's a few things that come to mind here, and I'm going to shift the conversation a little bit. A lot of the things that you've just described are happening again today, right? So a lot of the things that were happening at these different points. That's why I wanted you to just elaborate a little bit, and I feel like nowadays we're seeing the same type of thing happen, right? It's just that the landscape is different. We've got modern technology, we've got social media, we've got AI, we've got all these other tools at our disposal or their disposal. But I feel like much of what you've just laid out is actually happening in society today. And so, um, I think there's two things that come to mind. One is more of the sort of like the global consciousness, let's call it that, where you've got the collective of society is sort of waking up and going, hang on a second, something is not right here, you know what I mean? And then you've also got now, I'll call them leaders, but this is the challenge we have, right? And this is kind of where I want to go is you've now got someone like Donald Trump, right? And Donald Trump comes in and it's like, we're taking down the deep state, we're draining the swamp, blah, blah, blah. So it's like, I don't know where I sit with this, you know what I mean? I have mixed feelings, I have mixed opinions based on different types of evidence, and I think it's hard for people to parse. But is Donald Trump another Franklin D. Roosevelt? Is he another guy like or what we're seeing right now? And forget about left and right, and forget about like MAGA and the labels that are attached to this. I think like let's just sort of peel that back and talk about the underlying ethos behind that. Because I think where we're at right now is people are sort of going, holy smokes, like Pierre Poilievre would have come in. Let's just say that from Canada, right? Like Pierre's our guy. He's going to come in. He's going to be the guy to make the change. We've got Danielle Smith, who you mentioned earlier, and the whole Alberta separatist movement, which I think is perhaps a lot more authentic in the context of what we're talking about today. But someone like Donald Trump, I mean, the U.S. is obviously a very powerful country. We know that it's a world superpower. The U.S. dollar is the reserve currency, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Do you feel that like what's going on there? You know what I mean? Like there's so much going on with Trump and where things are headed, and it is destabilization at the same time because you can see that happening around the world. There's destabilization on multiple levels. Like, is this simply like a means to an end? Like, is this what we have to go through in order to get to the other side? Kind of like what you mentioned with the Great Depression. Like, do we have to get worse and worse and worse? And then everyone goes, holy shit, like, let's get behind this guy, and off we go to Kumbaya. I don't know what that looks like. But as I say, I have mixed feelings about it. I can kind of see the light.
Me
I can
too,
see the
dude.
dark. It's hard.
It is, and I don't have a crystallized. I've chosen to withhold my big judgment on what I think of Donald Trump so far. I know I've got many friends from a variety of opinions that are
Hmm.
very incompatible. Some of
Yes.
whom believe that he's like playing 17D chess,
Yep.
um, and others who believe he's a well-intentioned patriot being used by forces who recognize that they have created a mess and that they need to undo their mess if they're going to survive, meaning the danger of World War III. Um, and I have inversely people I respect who are of the completely cynical view that Trump is simply a very sophisticated part of this operation. So you got
Yeah.
the brilliance, the brilliant grand strategist. You've got the buffoon theory,
Yeah. Yeah.
uh, the 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 will the good buffoon. You got the bad buffoon theory, right?
Yep.
Bad buffoon who's right, and then you've got the evil uh player side of things.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think that there's certain coherent arguments with evidence that can back up each of those opinions.
Yeah.
Um, Unfortunately,
Yeah.
I
That's what
hate
makes it
saying
hard.
that.
That's what makes it hard. Yeah.
It makes it tough. I lean somewhere in the middle. I think I'm still operating on the hypothesis that he's a good person at heart and that he means well. That's where I'm operating under that. If it is, there's definitely, as I said, I spent a lot of time over the last few years, especially exploring occult agencies and secret societies to try to get as good of a mapping of their belief structure and their motives, their methods of thinking and their patterns of behavior and institutions that they have created to achieve certain ends that are tied to their cosmology. They have certain goals and ideals that as fucked up as they are, do animate them in a religious like manner. That's behind the growth of Darwinism, the appearance of like Newtonian physics,
Mm,
which comes
mm,
out of a Rosicrucian Neo-Templar psyop, just as Darwinism does a century later, or 180 years later, and just as
yeah.
modern quantum mechanics under Niels Bohr and the Rockefeller-funded machinery there. It's all part of this subversion. Um, so I see things now increasingly through the weird lens. So I'm looking at things through my weird polarization filter, where I'm looking for like that, and it bothers me straight up that so many of those things I've been exploring are very present in and
Mm,
around the figure of Trump. And here I'm referring to the transhumanist network and their very powerful influence, shaping the emerging new type of reform of the world system under this AI control grid. That's something that you and I have alluded to that I find
yeah.
disturbing as hell. I don't see a lot of critical remarks from Trump in opposition to this, and maybe he feels like he has to work with that. Maybe, maybe
Well,
he's a part of it. I
then
don't.
we're back to 17D chess, right? I mean, that this is where, and you know, our small
Yeah,
minds, Matt, you and me, we can't comprehend that, right? I mean, we don't know. We got to leave it up to the super brain
yeah,
powers, right, for 17D chess. But that's what I mean. Like, I know I'm being cynical, but it's like, but
yeah,
ultimately, like, this is where it comes back to, like, what do we do? You know what I mean? Like, as our sort of
yeah.
power, because the movements that you've described in the past, like, I have to wonder what was going on in the general population at those times. You know what I mean? Like, was there a huge rally around Roosevelt? Was
Well,
it like the general population were like, holy shit, let's
yeah.
just get ourselves out of here and he's our guy and you just do whatever it takes to get us through
There,
to the other
there
side?
was, there was, but at the same time, that general sentiment that gave their support to Roosevelt could have equally have given their support to a Mussolini fascist,
Well,
by and
right.
large.
Right. And so this is kind of something else I've been tapping into lately, which is the rebound effect, you know. So we've had like the whole world for the last 8 to 10 years, maybe even up going back up to 2013, has sort of been captured by this very, very, I hate using the word, but everyone will understand what it means. This very like woke sort of left, progressive kind of culture, right? Where like everything that we've done in the past has just been absolutely terrible. We have to just dismantle everything from the ground up and reorder society because of, you know, hierarchical layers of oppression and inequity and so on and so forth. And to the point where, I mean, we can all see that it's just gone off the rails completely. You know what I mean? Like where some of the things you look at and you're like, huh, sounds like an okay idea. And then you fast forward 20, 30 years and you're like, whoa, okay, hang on, that was not a good idea. I bring that up because the rebound effect is like the counter to that is far right, if you want to call it that, is fascism, right? Where it's like, hang on a second, society's gone completely out of control and we've lost our way and we need a top-down approach where we just need a good guy running the ship and everyone else can just fall in line behind that. And I feel like in some ways that's sort of what's going on, especially in the West. You know what I mean? Where
Yeah,
through efforts of destabilization, whether you want to talk about economic destabilization, cultural destabilization, erosion of national identities, all these types of things. And it's like, what's the solution? You know, how do we get order out of chaos, right? And it's like, who's going to be
I
the person
know,
to
I know.
provide the order? You know,
It's
it's
like it troubles me too because if you have, we the question of leadership has been hovering around this whole interview, and if you have somebody who is really a good person, like good from the capital G, like they understand evil, they know themselves, they're willing to die for a cause, they're bounded by their conscience, so they've like shaped their identity to be obedient to their conscience, and they use their mind in a creative and good way. um like people can read the or listen to or read the transcripts of John F. Kennedy's speeches, and this is a man who's profoundly steeped as a philosopher king. He earned the right
mm,
to uh to get political power. Or listen to Martin Luther King Jr.'s speeches, which even most young African American kids today, they don't do. They don't
yeah,
they don't
yeah,
listen to Martin Luther King Jr.'s speeches because it would undermine the entire woke model of organizing society if they actually like listen to what he was saying and what
mm,
he was
mm,
doing. And you're like, that's somebody who is willing to die for a higher sense of moral purpose. purposefulness that was tied to natural law. They had an understanding of that Augustinian Platonic natural law, as did Lincoln, as did McKinley. Read their writings, and as did Warren Harding, as did Roosevelt. Read People can read his writings and get to immerse yourself in the type of identity. And so when you have somebody good, yeah, it's true. Like they will be qualified to use political power and powers of the nation, which is a huge power, in defense of humanity and in opposition to the will of the oligarchical class. They'll often do it in a way that involves even training some of the more rational oligarchs to take on better behavior because
Hmm.
it's more incentivized to build a bridge and to build a viable economy, and you'll get more out of it and you'll be more secure in your investment than if you were to build or engage in forever wars, which will kill your
Yeah.
customers and it'll make so you we saw Vladimir Putin even conduct this in more recent times when some of the oligarchs that were given power by the West in the 90s in Russia, they were immensely wealthy billionaires, totally loyal to the Western oligarchs that groomed them and gave them power, like people Jeffrey Sachs was working with. But yet, when Putin came into play, assisted as he was by um, certain patriots within Russia who understood the nature of the beast, he was able to then pull out the carpet. They thought he was one of them. They thought he was going to play ball, and he danced a certain tune. Charmed certain bad people. And then when he did acquire power and had the opportunities, he took them, and many of them went to jail in Russia. Many of them escaped jail by getting sanctuary in London or New York, where they still exist, working against Russia. Like Berezovsky he died, but he was one of those. There's many others like that. Or some of them learned how to modify their behavior in accordance with the nation's mandate, and they still got to stay wealthy and rich, but they had to abide by a law of their nation. And does that make them trustworthy? Hell's no. They could still they could
Yeah.
be part of an operation to kill Putin and run a coup.
Yeah.
Maybe
Yeah.
many of them are, but you could still, like, you see how that people will often attack Lincoln, or they'll attack FDR, or they'll attack Putin for not making all the bad people go away and go to prison and
Mm.
still like work with them. And it's like, well, reality is not your fantasy, like it's there's a Realpolitik that people do. So all that to say, when there's a crisis, people become more willing to self-reflect and self-examine and be open to change that they would not be if things were comfortable. So
Yeah. Yeah.
there's truth to that. And we are certainly going into a crisis that'll make people way more uncomfortable than they currently are. That's true too.
Yeah.
And the question is, in my mind, does Trump have that philosopher king quality within him, or is it a shell? Is it a game within a game? If it's a game within a game, that makes it worse in many ways.
Yeah.
If he's actually representing, if at the best of the worst scenarios would be the scenarios that involve a, a lot more to work with for humanity, the best would be that he's actually a really smart patriot who's able to navigate bad people and still get good outcomes. That would be the best.
Yeah.
The second best would be he's maybe working with factions within the oligarchy that recognize that it is not in their advantage to burn the world in a nuclear holocaust and have to live to fight another day. And maybe that
Yeah.
will mean eating some humble pie, allowing America to restore some of its traditional systems of behavior, with the intention maybe of sabotaging it down the line, which I don't, because I think that ultimately, if an oligarchy is behind doing something that is good, it is only doing it to destroy a higher good, and we have to be on guard, kind of like the British Empire figures who
Yeah.
were fighting to keep the Hitler project going, even when other members of the British aristocracy said, no, it's gone too far. We have to abort and live to fight another day. Does that mean Churchill being a part of that faction represented the good? No, he was a fascist killer as much as Hitler, except that he was more reasonable and more
Mm.
loyal to the British Empire than he was to fascism. So he could be worked with for a time by Roosevelt, knowing that he could never be the one permitted to make decisions over what the world should be. That would be death. So, that would be currently the only the only way I could speak in a way that allows me to have faith in what I'm saying as a
Mm,
reasonable hypothesis is on that line that maybe that's what Trump represents. Hopefully I'm wrong and hopefully he's even better. But so far that's like where my heart is kind of shaping my hypotheses.
yeah.
Um, but otherwise, like if it weren't for I would say the if it weren't for Eurasia and the leadership that has emerged in Eurasia, I would also be a lot more depressed right now because there
Mm,
I've seen a more concrete expression of a rejection of the death cult agenda for controlling society, even though there's certain mechanisms in place in China or in Russia that as mechanisms are also compatible with fascism. There's a general cultural, philosophical, and behavioral rejection of the death cult Gnostic cosmology out of that part of the world and the way that they're organizing than anything I see in the West. So it does give us, I think, something to work with if we wanted to have a citizens movement that was actually viable. That
mm,
citizens movement itself would need to have leaders who are very well educated. But I mean, you would have to
yeah.
organize to understand that we need to try to make maneuvers that make certain policies more real than they currently are. And for that, I mean things like domestically, there are things that if we're going to save the lives of most of our fellow citizens, certain objective things have to happen, like the breaking up the Wall Street banks, the elimination of the unpayable derivative debts. That has to be sort of isolated, like you're defusing a bomb. That has to happen because it's going to blow up. And when it blows up, it's going to destroy all the supply lines. It's going to supply chains. It's going to
Yeah.
destroy a lot. People are going to go crazy. They're going to riot. They're going to starve. So to you have to quarantine the bomb. And Glass-Steagall was something that we had for many decades. It was removed under Clinton bill, but that the restoration of things like that, which is what Franklin Roosevelt did amongst his first few days in office, would be an important thing that citizens organize around. Trying to avoid war by getting collaborative policies uh, with Russia and China and others on projects that benefit us and that are not transhumanist, of which there are many, would be another thing for citizens to think about and to organize around in town halls and other things and put pressure on their elected representatives to do things like that. But I think too many people are trusting the plan or they've just inversely gotten
Yeah.
blackpilled and don't believe in anything.
Yeah.
So they're not doing any of that.
Yeah. Well, I think the black pill for sure. I mean, there's plenty of people that are, especially now. I mean, I'm just going to give you one example. Like, you look at someone like Carney coming in, right? And so many people had their hopes riding on Polyev and things were all going back to normal and we're going back to the good old days. And then Carney comes in, oh my gosh, now the election has been stolen and oh my God, and that whole story, right? And so, of course, I think that like knocked the wind out of a lot of people's sails where it's like, especially Canadians, like black pill, right? And I think the thing that so 100% I think you're correct. The other thing though is I think that we are constantly putting our faith that some leader must come and save us. And I think there's a lot of people, certainly people listening to this, where it's like no one's coming to save us. So that's not a black pill thing. Like just to be really clear on that, that's not a black pill statement. That is simply a statement that says if we're waiting for someone else to come and save us, we're in big trouble because what that means is, as you've said, through sorcery, through trickery, through narrative controls, through all the propaganda, all sorts of stuff. I mean, what was the whole elbows up thing all about? Like that was pure propaganda. That was a propaganda story through and through. And most Canadians bought that hook, line, and sinker, which is why Carney got back in. So my fear is that through narrative control and propaganda and the modern tools that we have, people are, I think there's something more to this idea of, I don't want to say revolution, but like really, really like big change, really thwarting this. Like I feel we're at this like it's a historic turning point in our evolution in a sense, something that's much bigger than ourselves. And I think that looking to leadership to, well, if we just get better policies and if we just make better laws, and it's like, well, the laws that we have are pretty good. They're just not being adhered to at all. They're just being broken the whole time. There should be people that should be being charged on charges of treason at the moment. So I think my point in saying all of this is looking to government and looking to leadership to help us out here. I don't know that for me anyway, I don't know that that's the best way to go. Do I have an alternate solution? Do I have a replacement theory? No, I'm not sure. But, you mentioned at some point on our travels today, you mentioned natural law. You mentioned common law. And I think that some of the work that I've been doing lately and the research that I've been doing into let's call it the sovereignty movement, and how especially the legal system, the judiciary, the political system has sort of been hijacked in a sense into the modern era where we're simply just chattel. You know what I mean? Like we're so I think I guess what I'm trying to say is, how do we take back, like, is there something that, you mentioned a citizens movement? What does that look like? I mean, is it a citizens movement where we all rally behind one guy and go, oh my gosh, he's our guy, he's going to get the job done? Because that's kind of what's happened with Donald Trump. I mean, landslide victory.
Yeah.
Or is there something
I mean,
else where we, the people, like, what does that look like? Do we change the system
yeah.
entirely? Do we go back to common law, natural law? I don't
Well,
know. I mean,
yeah, man. No, same thing. I guess the question is like, how do we look within ourselves and find out what attributes we need to have to become the bigger part of ourselves? Because most people that I know are not qualified to lead themselves, let alone another person.
mm, mm,
So to be a teacher in a classroom, you have to, it's assumed, have some qualifications and some courage to do it well, not to
yeah,
to tell kids
yeah,
what to think, but to good teacher. uh you have to really like love, you have to cultivate that power of loving the kids in order to give them the right balance of discipline and freedom, right? That allows them to make mistakes, not force it down their throats.
yeah,
um and so there's like, I think, like natural hierarchies in the universe and in nature. It's just that with humans it's contingent upon free will in everybody, and that means like the will to grow, to change, to improve, or to
mm,
not, to take responsibilities or to abrogate them. So like we're kind of, I think, all of us in that position where we have to decide, do we continue to be the consumer society sheep that we've been encouraged to adapt to become, or do we take on a rightful fight to try to invoke, in the time that we have, the more noble aspects of
yeah, yeah,
being human, which involves taking responsibilities for more than simply our mini self in the grand scheme of things. And we've wasted a lot of time. Um,
yeah,
so as far as what it specifically looks like I don't know in the current day and age what form that takes. I mean, I see examples of it now and again when I went to Calgary a couple of weeks ago, and it was, I saw some great examples of people who are organizing workshops, trying to understand banking, trying to, at the same time as they're organizing political campaigns to run for office. They've got people who have taken city councils, municipal councils,
yeah,
in
yeah.
various
Well,
parts of Alberta. And I appreciate the technique and the method and the courage and the passion and the that type of thing. I think is the coloring that I've recognized as being what has made anything viable ever work. So there's that. As far as like the big political mechanisms, where I've only seen somebody like a Trump get close to political power on the big level. Like, I don't
yeah,
know, we've wasted so much time that I it's hard for me to imagine how practically a fight with this. The oligarchy is highly centralized, highly global,
yeah,
very
yeah,
good at that, at
yeah,
wielding centralized global power, and they do it in the shadows, not officially.
yeah,
But they're so good at it, and the good guys are not so good at it. We tend to just want to, good people tend to
yeah,
want to be like left alone. I just want to like have my
exactly.
family,
Yeah,
have a nice job that doesn't suck, pay my bills, and just live my
yeah,
life and be left alone. That's most people's natural
yeah,
state, which is why, unfortunately, it's kind of, I chuckle uncomfortably because it's like that's why we haven't been good at wielding political power in a strong manner. So we got to figure out how that works, how to get good at that. And I just know certain things have to be done before the blowout happens, out of which we can't turn back. And I don't think, like, I thought about this for a while. I don't think the micro, like the build like mini micro parallel economies, like I so okay, there a lot of the most well-informed people that I know
hmm,
have naturally a very libertarian ethos, of somewhat
sure.
anarchistic ethos.
Yeah,
And I get it. Our society is
yeah,
so corrupt. You're like, I don't, it's easy not to have faith in government governing systems. And anybody listening to me just talking now kind of gets a sense that I don't have that much faith
Yeah.
in
If they've
my
listened to me
North
long enough,
American.
they would be on the same page. Correct.
Which is a sad irony, because the only time we've ever been able to, in my assessment, properly do battle with the oligarchy is when we've been able to utilize these types of political systems that we seem to have let go of for too long, and we've let our enemy take control of those things. Now we're in a bad pickle. So with the anarchistic sort of reaction that will come from the disenchantment of the corruption of the system, of the establishment, comes like these utopian idealistic uh views that I don't think are tangible, which is to create little breakaway microeconomies, or to go into purely, local off the grid living, which is, I mean, we should try to. I mean, I bought a house with my wife in the country for a reason, because I'm
Yeah.
trying to like do my best to take care of the material needs of my loved ones, my friends. If when shit hits the fan, I'm trying to do everything possible. Got a
Yeah.
garden. We're
Yeah.
trying to learn how to garden.
Yeah.
That being said, I don't think that's going to work at fighting the oligarchy. And if anything, I think that if everybody goes off into developing
Mm.
little micro communes, it'll only make us easier to pick off by a highly centralized oligarchical force that controls like space-based directed energy weapons and
Yeah.
fucking shit that I don't think I'll be able to fight them more effectively. I do think that, again, Russia and China, and to a lesser degree India, have done a better job at mobilizing their societies around rejecting the death cult and capturing their better tradition, like deeper historical values, and defending them than we have in the West. And it has given humanity as a whole, I think, more to work with. But it's not a guaranteed thing either, right? Like that
Yeah.
can also be subverted as well, just as we've seen it subverted in our Western societies. So um
Yeah.
I think a lot of our survival is dependent upon avoiding the oncoming war drive planned against Russia and China, and Iran too. There's ways of doing that. Accepting them and their offers to develop our economies together around high energy intensive, large scale mega projects that open up the door for cooperation on a variety of levels and uplift people to a better standard of living. And that force things like AI to behave according to the needs of humanity instead of seeing AI used to control humanity. So AI
Yeah.
is a powerful tool, and it's the question of what's the philosophy we use to apply that tool to either enslave or improve the conditions of being human in the universe.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
things like that are on my mind a lot,
Yeah. Well, I
but
mean,
I don't really.
everything's dual purpose, right? So like everything can
Yeah,
be used for good or for bad. And I think
yeah, right.
what you've shared in the last couple of minutes here, at least my take, and I'm going to get a little bit out there, perhaps, is like when we've exhausted all of these opportunities, and I don't want to say we've exhausted them because things are still happening, right? But I think what we've sort of danced around is the idea of really self-development, and perhaps more people need to self-reflect and be honest with themselves and, maybe come to terms with some of the stuff that's going on. But then it's like, how do we move forward? You know what I mean? And I've said for many, many years, like, I feel like there is some kind of, and take this how you will, but it's almost like it's a revolution in consciousness that's required. It's almost like a spiritual evolution. And again, take that how you will, if you want to take that in the religious context or more of the higher consciousness context or unified consciousness, however you want to interpret that. But I think that there's something there, you know what I mean? Because ultimately, as you say, like if we look at society, you mentioned the US or you mentioned the West, let's say, and you just look at what happens, right? I mean, like the erosion of, and I'm just going to pick one topic, the erosion of a national identity, for example, right? So it's like most people don't even know who they are. Most people don't know where we actually come from. We don't have the whole idea of a shared set of collective values has sort of slowly been eroded as well. And I think that coming back to that, what are the things that bind us together? What are the commonalities? Let's focus less on our differences and what does it mean to be human, and how do we move through this together? Because there is a mass destabilization effort underway. Pick a topic: housing, economy, inflation, whatever you want. The landscape is changing. We're coming out of this post-Second World War industrial economy, and we're moving into a digital age. And that even just from a workforce, from an education perspective, like we're changing so fast. Normally when you move through these periods, the periods happen quite slowly. You know what I mean? So once we had a tractor, suddenly, oh my gosh, agriculture took a different turn, but it took a long time for that turn to take place. Now it's like the turn is just happening at like lightning speed. And I think a lot of people are trying to just sort of get their bearings and figure out how we move forward with that, because all of these things are changing. So I think my message, or at least something I think about, is like collectively, doing the inner work, looking at this from a spiritual side of things, if you will, as well. And again, I don't know what that looks like on the other side, but I feel like there's something there. Like I feel like this pivotal moment in human history, there's something there, because looking externally to some power to come and save us, I'm not so sure I'm not gonna put all my eggs in that basket. Let me put it that way.
You don't believe our benevolent ET overlords are going to come in and save humanity from ourselves?
You know what? Who knows, right? I mean, what do you think
I was
about that?
joking.
Because I know you've done some stuff on like UFOs and all that sort of stuff recently, like and I actually have interviewed other people where we have spoken about things like that. I just, man, the whole purpose of the show is to explore different narratives and to explore beliefs like that. That's all I'm doing. And it's like some things I can really get behind, and some things I'm like, hey, man, I just want to hear about it so that I can understand it more. And
Yeah,
we're
no,
all,
absolutely.
that's really it, right?
Got to talk to
So,
everybody, man. No,
yeah,
absolutely. Got to
yeah,
talk to everybody. I'm of the camp, as you might have guessed from my
yeah,
smile. No, I think that's part of the magic tricks. But
yeah.
I've
Okay.
done a series of documentaries called The Hidden Hand Behind UFOs with my wife,
Hmm.
and we just released episode 4 on the myth of Roswell. And yeah, we're just going through the CIA occult agencies that have groomed us to accept a new religious reset around
Hmm.
alien gods that
Hmm.
will replace all the conventional religions. And they've been working at this for like a century. So we've been documenting that over the last 4 episodes. And we have another four
Yeah.
episodes to go to
Cool.
properly like tell the tale. But anyway,
Yeah. Cool.
yeah.
Well, Matt, I'm gonna let you get going, man. Thank you so much for your time today. It's always great to just sit and powwow and talk about stuff. I feel like we could talk for hours on all sorts of different things. But
Yeah.
nonetheless, I appreciate your work. For those of you listening, check out the show notes. I'm going to put down Matt's Substack and some other things. And yeah, Matt, thanks so much for your time today. Appreciate it.
Hey, a
All right.
pleasure. All right. Take care.
All right.
Bye.
Cool. We'll catch up with you all next time. Onwardpod.substack.com. And yeah, thanks for tuning in. All right. Bye for now.